Hi everybody, welcome to another Spectrum Economics video. Today I'm going to be talking about cost-benefit analysis, but it's going to be a little bit different from some of my other presentations. Just a little bit of a different take on it, and this is going to come under the cost-benefit analysis series, and as well as what I call the dark side of economics. So today I'm going to be focusing on how cost-benefit analysis can be done, and in many cases is done, as a form of manipulating the facts, basically, as a way of promoting a particular project in order to make it look better, in order to make it look like a better investment than it is. And there's a lot of tricks, and they're done in a particular way that they're very, very difficult to pick up. So certain things you have to look for. And many of you will probably know that cost-benefit analysis summaries are starting to sort of become more into public light than they have been in the past. And it's where I was previously working. I worked at Building Queensland, and they actually put cost-benefit analysis summaries. They're fairly short. They're like 4 or 5 pages in most cases. But certain things, as a general public, if you're able to have a look at that, there's often cases not enough information within those summaries to actually give you the information. But there's things to bear in mind, and especially if you're involved with cost-benefit analysis, you're working for the government and stuff like that, or if you're part of it and you're actually doing it in terms of what to look out for as a bit of a, we can call it a bit of a con job. Okay, so what is the first thing, and possibly the most easiest to manipulate? And that is the base case. So what exactly is your base case? So I'll just quickly define what that is. That is the state of the world without the project. So basically that is your as-is situation, and it's your as-is situation potentially going forward, or the state of the world, I guess, without the project, which could be some sort of minor investments and maybe a few policy changes and stuff like that. And a good base case has to be realistic. But what is realistic, though? And that is very hard to tell. And even if you go back 10 years later, you can find it's very difficult to tell whether your actual base case was accurate or not accurate. So it makes it a very easy one to manipulate. And if you want your project to look good or look better, then you basically come up with the worst base case that you can get away with. In the sense that, you know, the world is going to fall apart without the project. And this is something I should say you should never do, but basically it's done a lot, and it's reasonably easy to get away with because it's very hard to actually say, well, will that definitely not happen? And you've really got to get into the details of an analysis to actually find out where this has gone wrong. And that information is almost never available to the public. So it makes the creating an unrealistic base case, or a particularly bad base case, a very good way of making a project look a lot better than it is. Another one is assumptions. And any project is going to have assumptions. Any cost-benefit analysis is going to require assumptions because all information isn't going to be available. So what you can do, if you want to make your project look better, is come up with assumptions that put it in a better light, you know? But within reason. But if you have enough assumptions that are putting your project in a better light, even if they're not, you know, completely out there, as long as it's giving it a bit of a boost, it could get your project considered over the line. So what we consider over the line is that's when your benefits are greater than your costs. So you put in certain assumptions, maybe even about behavior, for example. So we could say, like, you're building a hospital. So as an assumption, you're going to assume that, you know, maybe 25% of people are going to be switching to a particular service. And in reality, maybe it's closer to 15%, but, you know, how do you know? This is certain things that are going to happen in the future, and assumptions have to be based around that. And you may have some evidence to suggest it could be somewhere between 15 and 30%. So then you go with 25, a little bit on the higher side. You get figures and sources of stuff that supports you, and maybe ignore some of the others, you know? Present the information and data supporting your assumptions that put it in that better light, and it just gives your project that extra lift. So how about growth as well? Growth is a key assumption in many cases, and this is one that's very difficult to predict. Because you look at over a history of growth rates, whether it's a growth rate in population, fairly constant, but if it is in terms, well, as a country, I might say it's reasonably constant. But as you go within smaller areas, there are fluctuations up and down all over the place. You know, it could be a development, people suddenly move here, and there could be some reason here people are moving away. So it fluctuates quite a bit. So it's very hard to argue against a growth rate, as long as you have some evidence And you could be taking some historical data that, oh, this is really good from such and such a year to such and such a year. And I was involved with a project where the last 2 years were ignored because there was basically no growth. But they took the previous 3 to 4 years where there was growth. So there are ways of cheating in terms of calculating your future growth. And again, as long as you can come up with some reason to support that, then it's going to be fairly easy to get away. And growth is very important in the sense that that is all your future benefits, basically hanging almost entirely on your growth. So if you have a very high growth rate, it will make your base case look bad because it doesn't have the capacity. It makes your big project look good because it has that capacity, and you're going to see much larger benefits. And the extent of those benefits are going to hang a little bit on your discount rate, because discount rate basically takes away future benefits through the whole discounting process, yeah? In the sense that, you have a higher discount rate. But anyway, ignore that for now. But growth rate is actually pretty critical in terms of getting those future benefits. And it's very, very hard to actually go in there and say, no, you're wrong. Interestingly enough, it is quite difficult. So it's something that can be defended simply because there's a lack of information or evidence suggesting that a growth rate is completely out. And saying that, insufficient sources of information or particular sources that make your assumptions look a little bit better. And this is done by economists, There's a lot of information out there at the moment with the internet and stuff like that. You may come across like 20, 30 different reasons why you may have an assumption, And the focus could be on just those particular ones that give it that extra boost. And a lot of other stuff would get ignored, There could be like, let's say you come across 10 documents. Let's say 7 of them suggest the particular growth rate is going to be on the low side. There could be 3 that suggest it to be on the high side. So what you do is you only include the 3 that's supporting your case. And the others aren't cited. So it's being selective in terms of your sources, in terms of your referencing. And that's a difficult one to prove as well. And it takes a lot of work going into all the sources and references to actually do it. You almost have to go in there and redo the entire evaluation. And again, that's something as well that's very rarely done from what I've seen in cost-benefit analysis, and that's ex-post evaluations. If you had an ex-post evaluation, it's a lot of work, but we actually would be able to uncover some of this stuff that's going on with your cost-benefit analysis that's artificially pushing up your benefits. But as long as there aren't ex-post evaluations, then it's going to be almost impossible to do so. So an ex-post evaluation, by the way, is a repeat of your initial cost-benefit analysis, but once you have more information, it's going to be 10, 15 years after the project is taking place. And generally money doesn't go into that. And with election cycles and stuff like that, there's very little interest in doing that or spending the money on that. So a lot of that stuff kind of gets forgotten, but that would solve a number of our problems. Another one as well, which is clever, it's sort of along the assumptions line again, but evaluation period. How do you come up with your evaluation period? Generally, economists will be pushing for longer evaluation periods. Like they'll look at it in terms of the asset life, and some of the assets may have 30, 40 years of life. So use that evaluation period. It may sound logical at first. You've got a hospital, it won't fall down for 50 years. But the thing is, chances are there'll have to be other things done in the meantime, and there'll be other upgrades going on and all of that need to be factored in that are clearly not, and the focus we placed on the asset life rather than the more realistic, the economic life in terms of how long that can support a particular system. So, and often as well, when modelling is done as well, you have this sort of linear growth rather than tapering off towards where your evaluation period should be. So having a longer evaluation period, because your benefits is what the evaluation period generally picks up, because your costs tend to be early on. And any future costs as well tend to be ignored, as I'll talk about that later, with a much greater focus around benefits. In fact, that's what I'll talk about right now, and that is, in terms of benefits and in terms of costs, more effort is put into your benefits side. Costs, you'll just have your basic. It might be your operating costs, your capital costs and stuff like that. And a lot of other costs, the user side in particular, are generally ignored. The effort goes into the benefits side of it. It's like we have benefits management, for example. It's not cost management, but benefits management, because cost management, people immediately think costs, but that's to the government, that's to the operating side of it, and it's very much focused on that. But the user side, the users have benefits, and they have costs as well, user costs. But the focus is on benefits and bringing out the most in those benefits, rather than focusing on the user cost side. And that gets very, very little attention and very little effort. The same goes for benefits that can't be quantified. You often see descriptions about if, for example, a project, for whatever reason, even after all the manipulation, doesn't get a good benefit-cost ratio or net present value. There'll be qualitative descriptions you'll see in there, talking all about the benefits. This couldn't be quantified, that couldn't be quantified, this couldn't be quantified, blah, 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 blah. You'll probably almost see nothing about costs that can't be quantified. There'll be almost no description or regarding costs exactly, oh, this cost couldn't be in there, that cost couldn't be in there, or whatever. That's generally ignored. But you have plenty of qualitative description around benefits. So even a project, for whatever reason, doesn't score particularly well, doesn't have a high net present value, you'll have a long list of qualitative stuff. Of course, if the project does perform very well and has a high net present value, that won't be included. But again, it's another way of trying to push it, trying to convince people that this project is good, just by having those qualitative descriptions in there for benefits. Another way around it as well is a lack of analysis on other options. Most of the time when you see a cost-benefit analysis, this is very typical in Australia, you'll have one project, maybe a second option, but that second option is almost identical to the first one. It's almost always high cost, high capital cost. And your low-cost options will get a mention, but that's normally very early on in the preliminary stage, and chances are they haven't run any sort of analytical analysis on it, an economic analysis. Most likely going to be a multi-criteria analysis. And a multi-criteria analysis, I know some people like it, but it's very, very easy to manipulate. In a sense, you can put low scores on some of your very, very low cost options that could have been really good, but because they never get to any detailed analysis, they get eliminated very quickly through tools such as your multi-criteria analysis. Or even triple bottom line could reduce and eliminate those options very early. So that's very something you should take note of if there's some manipulation going on. You'll see that you'll have a cost-benefit analysis, maybe 1 or 2 options are almost identical. If it's more genuine, maybe you'll see 5 or 6 options with a reasonably detailed cost-benefit analysis, and those options should vary quite considerably, especially in terms of capital costs and especially in terms of what they achieve. But that is very, very rarely seen, and the options analysis side generally is not included. Another interesting one as well is the modelling and the types of models that are used. And cost-benefit analysis generally involves the use of models and outputs from these models. So the type of modelling should reflect the type of problem you got or the type of project you have, the most suited to it. But what I found generally is the types of models, the type of modelling that is most popular are the types that produce the best outcome, the types that produce the highest numbers. And I've seen that several times as well, and you've seen switching between various things. And when I was in transport, there were some models, and I think AIM-Sum generally produce lower results than, I think, Visum, for example. So there's been a shift towards more of the agencies actually using the Visum model, and I could argue that it's better. I somehow suspect that that's not the case, but I suspect it's because it's giving them better results. And that is not the correct way of doing it, but again, that's a clever way of doing it in the sense you have a model, and the model might not necessarily be wrong, it could be perfectly okay, it just a little bit of tweaking here and there, and because of the scope of the model and all that stuff, the results are going to be a little bit different. But you get these smart economists, they'll pick the model that produces the better results. And it's very hard to disprove that that's actually wrong. Even with an ex post evaluation, it would be very difficult. So it's, again, a very clever way of pushing those numbers up. How about the effect on the network? And this is interesting, isn't it? For some of the very big projects, there will be very big network models and all that, and that will supposedly incorporate that, but it's done very, very generally, and those models pretty much focus entirely on terms of what the benefits are. They don't focus on what are going to be the extra costs. Like I've seen scenarios where you'd bridges, for example, you build a bridge, improve flood immunity, for example, the road's closed, let's say 2 weeks a year, new bridge, closed for maybe like 1 day a year on average. But what it doesn't tell you in the analysis, that doesn't make much of a difference because there's another bridge just 5 kilometers down the road that closes for 3 weeks of the year. So there is this network effect that needs to be taken in mind in terms of how the overall benefits fit in, but that is often excluded. this type of cost side of it. And the full network effect is not taken into, especially the negative side. If there's believed that there's very strong network benefits, then it will get a greater focus. If there's negative, then it won't. So it's interesting how much detail goes into that network analysis, and also the identification of when it's going to be a problem to the broader network and when it's going to be, a considerable benefit, and how that's focused on. Another thing that is often excluded, that I give credit though, most of the time it gets in, and that's negative externalities. And externalities generally don't form a very large percentage of your analysis, so that's why probably they get to sneak in sometimes. But some of the ones that are very damaging from a very broad perspective, it doesn't get included. It's more of the stuff like, your immediate emissions and gases and all that sort of stuff that gets included. And again, we can talk about what we mean by greenhouse gases and global warming and stuff like that, why those costs actually get put in, even though it may pull the analysis down, maybe only by 1 or 2%. That fits in with the whole global warming agenda and a certain amount of fear-mongering. But I'll talk about that another time. But yeah, there are certain negative externalities that don't necessarily get a mention. I mentioned about roads, but you can also talk about hospitals as well. Is an interesting one, because you're offering more services, but you could be taking services from elsewhere away, and that's not necessarily factored in, but more it's focusing on the people that are directly affected. But talk about that another time. Another thing is a sensitivity test. I think sensitivity analysis is an absolutely crucial part of a cost-benefit analysis. And pretty much almost all the cost-benefit analysis I've seen actually have sensitivity analysis. So where's the problem? A lot of them tend to be very generic and don't mean anything. As you can see from this table, assumptions like a certain benefit is up by 20%, a certain benefit is down by 20%, costs up by 20%, costs down by 20%. And how that affects your net present value and benefit cost ratio? They're just simple mathematical relationships. So if your benefit cost ratio is already 2, then every single test following this generic format is still going to give you a benefit cost ratio greater than 1. There's no real sensitivity test around that. What should be focused on should be your assumptions. What assumptions you put into the model. It should be some of your key drivers. It should be some of your parameters. It should be your inputs into the calculation. It shouldn't be your final result that gets sensitivity test based on some generic pattern. Like, for example, growth can have a huge effect for some projects and not for others. It could go from 3% to 5%, benefits blow out, or 3% to 1%. It could turn to nothing, but not for every single project. And that's why it's so critical that your key drivers are actually focused on, your key assumptions are focused on, the key parameters within your models are focused on. All of this stuff that's an input into calculation should be focused on, rather than a generic output change by percentage. Because basically you kind of know the answer beforehand. Changing by 20% here and there, if you've got a benefit cost ratio that is, like I say, just above 1.5, it's not going to make a difference. Simple mathematical relationship. It's not a proper sensitivity test. But you'll be fooled because a lot of them do that. And you've got to be wary. And hopefully those sensitivity tests can be put in their summaries. I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to look at the ones that are published, but that is very, very critical. Another thing I want to look at as well, just before I end, and something that's generally not included, and this is to talk about the cost side, in terms of your estimates and all that. Estimates tend to be, these days anyway, blown out to be fairly large. I know there was problems, optimism bias, haven't talked about that today. Potentially where costs were considered low, and some people say, well, benefits are higher because of optimism bias. It's just true to a certain extent. I think there's more manipulation behind it than the bias. But anyway, with costs, not so much of an optimism bias now, but they do tend to blow out a little bit. And there's a use of what we call P90 estimates becoming very prevalent, and they tend to be quite high, because you've got supposedly a 90% chance that your costs will not exceed that estimate. But what's included in there as well, which is not pulled out, but your profits to your big construction companies, or your profits to your consultancies that become part of these costs. But this is all held within the cost itself as part of your capital cost. But that is not extracted out. So we don't know what those profits are. And we don't know how much a profit and where that profit's going. But in a sense, that we've got these businesses that are making a lot of money through construction, but it pretty much goes undetected. if we had a more transparent cost-benefit analysis, we should bring out those profits and then we would see who is really benefiting. So what you would see then is your costs would include those profits, as well as the profit would also go on the other side of the equation as well, because that is a benefit in a sense to your construction companies. And the benefits that are in there to people like us that have been exaggerated, they should be corrected accordingly. And some of the problems I mentioned earlier should be sorted out, as well as the benefits to users, to commercial users. Some of those are probably more or less fairly accurate, but you really want to get a good picture about who is actually benefiting from these investments. And the way cost-benefit analysis is currently set up, it's very distorted, and it looks like the people are the ones that are benefiting from it, and that these investments are good and they should be done, and some of your smaller cost solutions don't get considered, and they're eliminated early on through processes like, multi-criteria analysis. Anyway, that takes me to the end of this video. Again, many people will find this quite controversial, like pretty much all of the videos that are going to be part of this dark side series. But if you liked it anyway, click the like button. I hope you did. I hope you found it very informative. And if you want to see more of these videos, we've got one on taxation, got one on health. You're going to have one on war coming out as well. So remember to hit the subscribe button. I have plenty of other content as well on this channel relating to micro and macroeconomics, and also what I call vegan economics, and I'm going to be producing videos relating to those chapters fairly soon. So again, that's another reason for you to hit that subscribe button. And I'd like to thank you for watching today's video, and I will be seeing you soon.